My name is Jane Noble. I was born in 1930, and I'm 87 years old.
And where were you born?
My parents just happened to be in California, and I was born in Orange County, Fullerton, and they brought me back here when I was 3 months old. So I'm a native.
This interview is for the Farmington Oral History Project, and we just want to verify that we have your permission to use the interview.
Certainly.
Who were your parents?
My father was Jack Broyles. My mother was Kathleen Reed, and her mother was Tallulah Cato from Cato Springs. But my mother and father divorced in 1934, so that's kind of a mess. And then she remarried, and she married Jesse Coleman. And I have a half-brother, or I did have. He died a couple, 3 years ago. My half-brother was named David, and he was a musician. And then my father's had three brothers, Ingalls Broyles and Hunter Broyles and Russell Broyles. And Ingalls was always a teacher, and he was the superintendent of Farmington schools in the 40s. And of course, my uncle Russell was postmaster here. And we were all direct descendants of James and Jane Kennebrew, who came here in 1833.
Did you have any other siblings when you were growing up?
No. I was an only child except for my little half-brother, and he was born when I was about 10 years old.
What business was your family in, or what jobs did they do?
Well, basically, the older generation, they were farmers. And as I said, my Uncle Russell was the postmaster. My father sold shoes from the manufacturer to the shoe stores. He was I forgot what he called him, but anyway, that's what he did all his life. He lived the last number of years in Shreveport. And so I was basically estranged from him, but I saw him from time to time.
When you were growing up, where did you live?
My folks moved so much. I lived here in Farmington quite a bit, and I always had folks here, so I would come here even if we lived someplace else. I spent a lot of time here. Spent a lot of time with my grandmother, my father's mother. And we lived in Fayetteville quite a bit. And we lived in California a little bit I was out there in 1938, I guess, 37, 38. And then again in 1943, we were there for a while. I always loved it out there, but I didn't get to live there too much.
Tell me about your earliest memories of Farmington.
I can remember something. My mother was so surprised. I could remember being in a little stroller. It was a little canvas type of stroller. And my mother was pushing me on the highway there, going up to my grandmother's. And I told her about it. She said, "You couldn't remember that. You were only 18 months old." And I said, "Well, I had a little bonnet that kept flipping down like this." She, "Yes, that's true." So my earliest memory is 18 months old. But aside from that, I could remember when I was about 4 or 5, when the big mill burned in Farmington. There was a big flour mill. It was down there on Goose Creek, down where those little shops are now. Down, just north of the bridge there at Goose Creek. And I was out at my Uncle Hunter's, who was up there on Hunter Street, and we saw this enormous fire, way high. And we thought maybe it was my grandmother's house or my Aunt Bertha's house. And we didn't have a phone out there. This was in 35 or 6. And had to wait till Uncle Hunter came home and found out it was the mill that burned. And the mill was a 3-story wooden building. And it had been built by my great-grandfather, William Henry Ingalls, and had been sold. But it was a very windy day, and there was a little black shop built behind McNeil's store, and it caught on fire. And the wind picked up a burning shingle and blew it all the way across. It landed on the roof of the flour mill. And of course, there was nothing to save it because it was all wood, and flour explode. The dust from the flour will explode, and it did. And so it was lonely in Farmington after the mill burned, and it no longer had a noon whistle, and it was just real sad. But I remember that, and that was one of my earliest memories. And I remember when Stark's Brothers Nursery was here. Are you interested in that? Well, Stark's Brothers Nursery came here in 1902. And my Uncle John Kennebrew sold all that property there to Stark's. And my grandmother said he sold it for a song and sang it himself. And that's where the family fortune went. But he sold all that land to Stark's Brothers. And I remember seeing a letter from my Uncle Willie Ingalls, who had written to somebody, and my family never threw away anything that was written down on paper, so I had a lot of letters to read. And he said that he had been out watching them plant peach trees in the snow. And they planted the seed, and then the peach tree seedlings would get so big, and then they would graft them and all that. But for a long time, Farmington was a company town. And just about everybody worked for the nursery. Spring, summer, and fall. In the wintertime, there was no work. And but they got by, of course, wages were abysmally low, but they raised big gardens, and the women canned all these things, and they just got by. And in the wintertime, all the men who didn't have a job would go down to McNeil's store or White's store, and they called them the loafers. And they just sort of hung around down there and talked to each other. I have a picture someplace of some of the loafers. I'll try to find it. But it stayed there until it was well after World War II before Stark's pulled out. I think in the 50s or early 60s or sometime before they finally all pulled out. But for many, many years, Farmington was and I can remember sitting out in my grandmother's front yard, and the teamsters would come in from the field. They had mules. They plowed the fields with mules. And they would come in down Rays Mill Road, the ones I remember, and the teamsters would be riding their lead mule and leading the other one. And I remember Shorty Briscoe was the lead teamster, and he'd be the first one. They'd come down Rosemill Road and then turn right through the gate that was there Oh my, how would I explain how that gate was? It's all changed so much, but they would go through a gate, and the big mule barn was up there, but they would turn left then and go down to where Goose Creek was running right by White's store. And um, there were watering troughs built of stone and filled by the spring there. And they'd take the mules down and water them, and then take them back up to the mule barn. And the mule skinner was, I'll have to think of his name. I'm having a senior moment. But then he took over and took care of the mules. And I can remember that vividly. Then eventually they got a tractor, and it wasn't as romantic anymore. But Mr. Bentley was the superintendent of the nursery. I remember that. And they had the railroad used to go through here. Oh, along where 170 comes down. It was sort of there, and it went clear down and around by Walnut Grove. And out there they had a packing shed with a siding, and they would take the trees that they had grown, and they would graft them and bud them and all that sort of thing, and wrap them and send them to Louisiana, Missouri, which is where the headquarters of Starks were, and they would be mailed out then. And the railroad was pulled up during World War II, and they said it was for the war effort, but it wasn't. It's just that railroad that went from Fayetteville, well, it went from Monette or something, but into Fayetteville all the way to Muskogee. And I know when it got to Westville, it connected with the Kansas City Southern, so you could go anywhere from here. And it just wasn't being very profitable. So Frisco pulled it up. And there was a depot out here. It was about, it's all changed up so much. But it was kind of where 170 came down a ways. There was a depot there, and a siding and some big packing sheds. And this was strawberry country. And in the spring, everybody had their strawberries, and they would take them out to the packing shed, and then load them on to refrigerator cars. Well, they're really ice in those days, and take them off wherever they were taking them. And everybody went and picked strawberries. And the first job I had when I was 11 was I got on one of the trucks and went out to the strawberry patch and picked strawberries. And we would earn a few cents for each little quart basket. And my Uncle Russell had a strawberry patch down where the old mill had burned, and those were big strawberries. That was alluvial land, of course, and also what was left from the mill burning. And he had this little strawberry patch. And he built me a little 4-quart carrier. And I went down and picked strawberries for Uncle Russell. And my Uncle Albert Gaskell was the row boss. And I remember he fussed at me because I hadn't cleaned my rows. So I went and told Uncle Russell. Uncle Albert got on me. And Uncle Russell said, "Well, kid, if you're going to work for the other fella, you just have to take some of that." So that was a life lesson for me. I'm having a senior moment. I don't know where to go from here.
It's okay. We'll just keep you going. What other local businesses do you remember way back in the day in Farmington? I know there were some stores here. What do you remember about them?
Oh, those stores. White Store was right down by Goose Creek. There's a little shop there now. And early on, the little side sort of lean-to building on the west side was the post office. And Bill and Oleg Williams were the postmasters then. And then after my Uncle Russell and Aunt Clara became postmasters, they moved it. But when I was very young, the post office was there. And White's grocery store. And it was a good-sized grocery store. A lot of people went there. And they had their gas pumps out in front. And then on the corner of Bodark and Highway 62, there's that building with a false front. It's still there. And that was McNeil's store. And it was a general store. They sold shoes and fabric and groceries and all sorts of things. And those were the places in the wintertime when the men who were out of work went down and loafed.
Tell me more about the stores you remember.
Well, about 19 and just before the war, I believe it was, 1940 something, Delance Phillips built a store that a little built of fieldstone. The building's still there. And when he went to the Army, his mother and father ran the store until he got back. But that one was started, it wasn't as old as the other two, but it's been there since the 40s. And it was there until, it was still there when Jocelyn was young. Yes, it was.
The stores were more than a place to buy stuff. What else? What other functions did they have in the small town?
Well, sometimes somebody would put in a little restaurant for a little while, and it would last a while, and then it would go away. But all these places, like the stores, like that, were places to exchange information. And that's where you got the news of what was going on. And the men went down and sat around the Cracker Barrel and talked, but women would go down and they would visit, like Miss Sue McNeil would always be in there, and the women would go down and talk to Miss Sue. And they would find out what was going on in town. Because in Farmington, there was no newspaper, or you had the party line on the telephone, and they got quite a bit of information off of that. I can remember my grandmother listening. They had a telephone that was on the wall, big phone, and you had a receiver. And I can remember her listening. My grandmother you wouldn't think she'd do anything like that, but she just couldn't resist the party line. And the women would have quilting bees. I remember my Aunt Maggie having quilting bees. And then the church, just about everybody went to church. Early on, there was just the Methodist church and the Christian church, quite early on. And one was, first, my earliest memories were going to Sunday school at the Methodist church, the one that was up on White Street. And that church was built on land that my great-grandfather Ingalls gave to the church. there's a story that the presiding elder had come out and had dinner with the Ingleses, and after dinner, William Henry asked him if he would like to go for a walk. They walked around to this real woodsy place and followed a little path through a kind of thicket, and there was a sort of hollowed out place there. And my great-grandfather said to the presiding elder, "This is my place of prayer. And I would like for this place to be where a church is built." And so he donated that to the Methodist Church, and that's where they built that church on White Street. And it had a stained glass window, which they moved to the church, the new church. And then above it was a portion where they had the names of the first 6 families who founded Ebenezer, the first Methodist church here. And I hope I can remember all of them. There was the Kennebrews, James and Jane Kennebrew, Woodruffs, there were Trents, I think Polson was one of the names. I can't call the names of those last 2 for some reason. I have it written down somewhere. But that part of the window has been preserved in the new church, so I'm told. And so it's can be seen there. And they started this little Ebenezer church, a little log cabin. They finally, at first the little congregation just met in different homes, but then they built this log cabin, Ebenezer, they called it. And it was both the church and the school.
Tell me what it was like going to school in Farmington. You said you went on and off to Farmington. Tell me more.
Yeah. Well, there was a brick building. You know, after Ebenezer, there was another building called Hawthorne or something like that. I don't remember about that. And then they built this brick building. It had 3 rooms. And the building is still up there on the campus somewhere. It's been covered up with cosmetic something, but it's still there. And there were 3 big rooms and a hall. And the 1st and 2nd grade was in one, and the 3rd and 4th, and then the 5th and 6th. And I went to school in all those rooms at one time or another, but when I first started, it would be 1936, and my first teacher was Mrs. Curtis. And I can remember she had a time with me because the little stories in the book, after I'd been read over a couple times, I had it memorized. And so all I had to do was see the picture and I could say it. And so she pasted pieces of paper over the picture so I couldn't see that. But I'd start to read the first 2 or 3 words that I'd have it memorized. So she had a terrible time teaching me to read. And I don't think I really learned good until I went to a school where they used flashcards and taught me words. But anyway, she was the 1st grade teacher there for a lot of years. And they would have little programs. Sometimes the high school would put on a play, say, and the grade school would have a little part of it. And they had a rhythm band, and we all had little instruments, little bells and different things. And she would play the piano, and we would play the little rhythm band. And that's the way the children got to perform. And it would be in the evening, and there'd be a crowd there, and it would be in the auditorium of the high school. The high school was another brick building that was built in 1924. And the first graduating class was in 1928. I know my Uncle Russell was one of the graduates. And I went to high school there. It was, I went in the 40s, let's see, 44, I guess, when I was a freshman there. That's where I learned things like algebra and geometry. And my Uncle Inglesborough was the superintendent. And I know one of the teachers in the grade school was Marie Brown, who was old family, Bill Beckett's aunt. And she taught there for a long time. And school was so much different in those days. We found ways to entertain ourselves, like if it rained or something like that, where we're stuck in the building. And we'd do things like diagram sentences on the board, or the boys would work these long problems. And we didn't know that we were deprived. We were quite happy. And some of the people I went to school with were Jimmy King and Junior Allen, Willie Hickman. I'm trying to think of people who had families here that were in my grade.
Who are some of the teachers you might remember?
There was a Mrs. Kerr. They lived up there on the highway. They weren't from here, they'd moved in here, but she was a very good teacher. And I remember Mrs. Ziegler, they had moved in here from somewhere, and she taught Spanish. Lena Bell Brown also taught. That was Marie Brown's sister. She taught some. And of course I mentioned Mrs. Curtis. Fred Starr, when he was taught English in the high school, well, his wife, Mrs. Starr, taught over in the grade school. Fred Starr was a columnist for the paper, and he wrote a kind of a humorous column. And he was an after-dinner speaker. He spoke around, but he taught school there at Farmington and taught me English. And they used to put on plays. The high school classes would put on plays. There would be a junior play and a senior play each year. And there would also be one that was just for the whole high school. And either Mr. Starr or my uncle would direct them. And we would get a full house when we put on a play. That high school had an auditorium and a stage, and it would be packed when we'd put on a play. Make some money off of it. And I was in a couple of them, but I can't remember the name of them right now. I don't guess it matters. But it was a big deal when they had, and then on Halloween they had a carnival. And everybody came. They had booths and everything, and it would just be crowded. It was the same way at the church. When they had anything, everybody went. And then after they got television, and after so many families, both parents had to work, they just didn't come out to those things like they used to. But they used to have what they call protracted meetings at the Methodist Church. In the Baptist Church, they were called revivals, but in the Methodist Church, they were called protracted meetings. And some minister would come and preach every night for a week, and it would the house would fill up every time. And then they would have all day dinner, all day preaching and dinner on the ground, or we'd say all day dinner and preaching on the ground. And we'd have everybody would bring food, and it would be outside. I'm going to have to stop.
You mentioned earlier Russell Broyles.
Mm-hmm.
He was real big in the community and ran the post office. Tell me more about him. What was he like?
Well, he was, like me, he was a history buff. And between the two of us, we gathered together a lot of stuff. And we took a lot of it to the special collections at the university as a lot of our documents. He was quite a politician. He never ran for anything, but he was a Democrat. And he said John Paul Hammerschmidt was the only Republican he ever liked. He was also in real estate. And during the war, when you just couldn't get lumber or anything, it all went to the war effort, get very little. And he would buy an old house and have it torn down and use the good wood in that to build a little white house and sell it. He made a lot of money. And nice little houses. They had no children. And my Aunt Clara, she was from Madison County. I don't know how he met her when she came over here to go to the university, I think. But I remember one time when I was 3 years old, and I lived with my mother and daddy in Fayetteville. And they took me up to the square in front of Camel Bell's to see Santa Claus. And so I looked at him and I said, "That's not Santa Claus, that's Uncle Russell." And it was. He had a job that year of dressing up like Santa Claus. Didn't fool me. And I don't know, that he was an interesting man. He was an interesting man. And I just thought the world of him, and so did my kids. And we all just thought the world of Uncle Russell.
Tell me some things when you were a kid and fairly young. What did you and your friends around the Farmington area do for fun?
One of the things we would do, and especially in the fall of the year, we would take what we call our hikes. A bunch of girls get together, sometimes some boys, go on a hike. Well, it was more of an amble. We didn't really get down to business. And we'd go nuts, pick kinky pins and hickory nuts and things like that. I remember us doing that. And then we had play parties. Every now and then somebody decided to have a party. And everybody would come and we'd play games. And sometimes some of the older kids, they would play post office, which was kind of a kissy face kind of thing. And we did that. And of course, if you went to church, like at the Methodist church, on the, certain evenings they would have what they call league, which was the young people's meetings. And they'd go to league. People would go. And of course, the big deal was going to Fayetteville and going to the picture show. That was the big deal. And we loved to go to the picture show. It was It was a nice time. You you could you didn't dare get in trouble because if you did, somebody would tell on you before you even got home. People looking through lace curtains, and so you had to be pretty much on the up and up because everybody was watching. There were, I could recall, in the 30s, there was a sign, Farmington, population 98. But there were a lot of big houses and they're gone now, most of them. There were big white houses all up and down the highway, and most of them had been torn down. My grandmother's house is still there, and my Aunt Bertha's house is still there. But the Kennebrew house and the Kennebrew house that's there now is not the original. The original was my grandmother said was a double log house, 2-story, with a dog trot through the middle of the lower story. And that was built when they first came here in 1833. And then after the Civil War, the Kennebrews had 2 sons and a daughter. The 2 sons went to the Confederate Army. Uncle John was really too young, but he was a drummer boy. And James, his older brother, didn't come back. And John married Virginia Shreve. So Catherine Shreve and I were good friends, and we used to laugh about her great-great-aunt was married to my great-great-uncle. And so Virginia wanted, Aunt Jen we called her, wanted an up-to-date Victorian house. And so that's when they built that one. Now the Ingalls house, which is on the next hill, was built when Isabella Kennebrew married William Henry Ingalls. They built that house, and it was built in 1854. And it's still standing. But when my Aunt Bertha and Uncle Albert lived there, Uncle Albert was a carpenter, and he kept it up. And so that's the reason it's still there, in good shape.
When you were a kid, what would your parents and adults their age do for fun?
Well, they would call on each other a lot in the evening. Now, in the afternoon, the ladies sometimes would call on each other. Every afternoon, the lady of the house would get her housework done and put on a clean print dress and wait for in case somebody came or in case she wanted to go visit somebody. And in the evening, people just visited each other. And they were all raconteurs. Everybody could tell a good story, or most of them could. And I can remember them telling ghost stories, just scary to death. And they would talk. And then, of course, when there was anything going on at church or at the school, they would go to that. And that's about what they did. Of course, they worked hard. They didn't feel like running around a whole lot, but that's sort of what they did.
Let's talk about how the town has grown over the years. What do you remember about how it went from having less than 100 people to over 6,000? What do you remember about the growth from over the years?
After the war, after World War II, it just people started coming in here in northwest Arkansas. And the whole country just kind of filled up. and Farmington became a bedroom town for Fayetteville. It just happened kind of suddenly. All of a sudden, there were houses everywhere. All the nice hay pastures and cow pastures were made into housing. So, and it just happened. It wasn't like somebody put in a big business here or anything like that. Farmington just more became a bedroom town.
What other stories can you think of maybe that I didn't think to ask about that you could tell me?
There was the Cairns-Wilson light. That was a big story. I wrote a poem about it, a ballad, most popular thing I ever wrote. It was printed in the flashback. And the old lady Wilson, when she died, told her son not to sell the property, that she would come back and haunt him if he did. Well, she died and he did. And then he started seeing this light. And would you like for me to read you that?
Tell me the best you can remember, and then we can maybe read it later.
Okay. The Cairns-Wilson light was seen by a lot of people. And it was, everybody thinks, it was old Mrs. Wilson haunting Cairns. Cairns' name was Arkansas, but they called him Cairns. And the Carmelites, the Christian church, had come in and built a church. And there was kind of a hard feelings from some of the Methodists about the Carmelites. And Mrs. Wilson didn't like them. So when Cairns first saw that light and he followed it, after he had sold his property, he had given some money to that church to put a roof on it. And he followed that light, it went up to the top of that church and then went right straight up. And so he knew it was his mother. And one time, when I was about 12, my grandmother was standing in the east window looking down toward Goose Creek, and she was looking. And I said, "Mom, what are you looking at?" And she said, "Down there." And I would look, and she said, "See that light down there?" "Yeah." "That's the Cairns-Wilson light." And the hair on the back of my head just stood right up. And so I have seen the Cairns-Wilson light.
Tell me more about it.
Hmm?
Tell me more about the Cairns-Wilson light.
Well, it's still around. People see it from time to time. And I've got it all written down. I wrote this kind of a ballad about it when I was, in my 20s. And at that time, there were still old-timers around. And they said, yeah, that's the way it was. And I think it was published in the flashback. I'm pretty sure.
Do you remember when they paved the road in Farmington and what it was like before and after the paving of the highway?
When we went to California in 1936, it was not paved. It was a gravel, the highway was built and the bridge was built and everything, but it was gravel road. And then when we came back here in 1939, it had been paved. So I remember one time, I guess I was about 5, and they used to have, at Prairie Grove, where they now have the clothesline fair, they used to just have what they call the reunion. And it was a Civil War reunion. And they would gather down there, and there would be a little carnival usually in connection with it. And I could remember going there one time, it was in August, it was hot. And I went with my grandmother, and Uncle Russell took us. And I could remember on that bandstand, there were a couple of men in gray uniforms, old men with long beards in gray uniforms. So this was 36, and there were still some Civil War veterans alive. And on the way home, we were driving over this dusty gravel highway. And in those days, everybody was always having flat tires. And they had kits where they could mend it was kind of complicated, but they could mend the inner tube and everything. So, oh, it was hot. And we were driving along, had a flat. And so Uncle Russell got out, was starting to fix the flat, and somebody drove up behind us that he knew, and so he asked them if they would just take my grandma and me home, that he could fix the flat. But one of the men stayed with him. I don't know who it was. And so they took us home, and oh, it was so nice to get home under those shade trees. But after sometime 1938 or 1939, they paved that highway. But now Highway 16 didn't get paved until after World War II. It was a gravel road.
What other stories can you think of that I haven't thought to ask you about?
In which direction?
If anything.
I don't know.
Let me ask you this: if somebody asked you about Farmington and they'd never been here ever, and said, "What is your town of Farmington like?" What would you tell them?
Well, now, as I said, it's just a bedroom town. It doesn't have as much interest to me as it did when it was smaller. And but that's because I'm old and can remember. Apparently, it's being well managed, and the school gets honors every now and then. I know the band recently got a superior rating, and things like that makes me proud of the school. Because when I went, there was no band. We did have a basketball team, and we didn't have a gymnasium. Just had clay courts out there, 2 clay courts. But the boys did well. And if it rained, they couldn't practice, but they practiced a lot, and they practiced on the weekends, just them. And they went to state. And I remember that one team went to state. Jimmy King was there, and Junior Allen, Gene Stapleton. Who else was on that team? Albert Hess. There were more, I just can't think right now. But although they didn't have a gymnasium, they got good enough, they went to state. And back when the high school was first built, they had a basketball team. I know my Uncle Russell played on it, though he wasn't very tall. He still was scrappy. And Thornton Buchanan was on that team, and they won state. Well, I didn't actually see this, but I heard about it. In the 60s, I guess, 50s or 60s, most of the men who were on that team were still alive. So they thought it would be a good fundraiser to have that team come and play the high school team. although they were old men, not old, 40s, someplace in there, but compared. So it was a big deal. They had a lot of people went, and the high school team was kind of cocky about it. You know, they're going to run circles around these old men. But those old men beat them. And my mama saw it, and she said Thornton Buchanan, who was real tall, so there was one of those little high school boys, was so frustrated that he patted him on the top of the head. But those, you know, there wasn't much to do, so they practiced all the time. On the weekends and everything, they'd go up and practice if it was good weather. So they just got real good. And I can't remember who else was on that team.
If you ask you to complete this sentence for me, how would you do it? My favorite thing about Farmington is.
I suppose it was the feeling of everybody knowing each other when I was a child. And although there were some arguments and fusses and things that went on sometimes and some scandals, still, everybody knew each other. And if somebody was sick, or had an accident or something, people would come and take care of them. Even if there was someone they'd fallen out with, they'd still come and take care of them if they needed it. And I think that was the feeling, that you knew everybody and you were pretty safe. And I liked that feeling. Of course, in those days, I was kin to about everybody on one side or the other. And my mother's mother was a Cato from Cato Springs. So we'd go over there and see those folks. It was just nice.